From the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum. The North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Over the past 5 years, we have been bringing you a series that's about 12 weeks long each year, entitled Journey Through Time. This year, we're taking a look at America's 20th century. We brought you our first program last week, and this is program number 2 in a rather long series. And today we wish to welcome to the program one of our very favorite people, Dr. Clay Jenkinson, who's been with us through this whole journey each year. He is a brilliant scholar. He is a Rhodes Scholar. He's taught at the University of Nevada at Reno, and he's very busy now traveling and lecturing and writing books. He's here today in the capacity as Dr. Robert J. Oppenheimer, who lived from 1904 until 1967. Dr. Oppenheimer was known as the father of the atomic bomb. He was often been described as a brilliant theoretical physicist, and the bomb was exploded on July 16, 1945, after a competition between the United States and Hitler's Germany, who would get this weapon first that could bring an end to World War II, and it was used, in our case, on Japan, and then they surrendered following 2 bombs being dropped over 2 different dates. Dr. Oppenheimer, welcome to the program. Thanks for coming back from the past in the year 2000 to be with us on our program.
I'm not certain that it's any honor to be called the father of the atomic bomb, but I did play some role in the development of that device.
Thank you for being here. And as always, every year we have our 2 regular panelists to discuss with our famous people in history. First of all, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho in the year 2000. And next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And we shall invite Janelle to commence the questioning with our famous guest.
Dr. Oppenheimer, can you tell us a bit about your past so we will know what kind of person you are?
Born in 1904 in New York City, my parents were part of the Jewish diaspora to the United States, non-practicing Jews. I grew up as a precocious young boy. By the time I was 11 years old, I wrote a letter to my cousin saying, "Ask me a question and I shall answer it in classical Greek." I was as bookish and as otherworldly as it's possible to be. I went to Harvard at the age of 18. I took a degree in 2.5 years in chemistry, summa cum laude, and went on to earn postgraduate degrees at Cambridge University in Göttingen, where I took my doctorate in 1927.
You ended up teaching.
At Berkeley.
As a matter of fact. You chose to go west.
I chose to go to Berkeley. I'd always been fascinated by the West, and as a young man I had some serious illnesses and was taken by an English professor of mine out to the mountains of New Mexico. There I fell in love with the Southwest, and particularly the area around Los Alamos. But when I had choices, I had 10 job offers after my doctorate, I decided that the West Coast would be interesting for 2 reasons. Partly it was the West, and partly there was no school of theoretical physics. There had been no quantum mechanics taught at Berkeley, and I was able then to create the first truly quantum mechanics institution on the West Coast of the United States.
Steve Schenck.
Dr. Oppenheimer, did you have any other, we're going to get to the Manhattan Project eventually, as I'm sure you know, but were there other significant scientific successes in your life? I know you weren't chosen to head that project based on your fluency in classical Greek.
That might have been a useful background. I also read Sanskrit and Italian and Latin and several other languages, and I must say I'm a bit of a dabbler. And it was often charged against me that although I was a brilliant physicist, I was not the kind of man who could have won the Nobel Prize in physics because I didn't have that stick-to-itiveness, that stamina. But it is true that I preferred to spread my mind as broadly as I possibly could. I preferred the poetry of T.S. Eliot to lab work, frankly. But I wrote pioneering papers in neutron star theory and also in an adumbration of what became known as black hole theory. And I was probably as adept a student of quantum physics as the United States had. No one knows much about quantum mechanics, but I was credited with being as brilliant in that field as anyone in this country.
Let me ease us into that Manhattan Project discussion that we know we're all headed for. Did you go to that project willingly, or did you go out of a sense of responsibility given the times and what was at stake?
There were several motives. One was that I was asked, and when one is asked to engage in a project of this kind of magnitude, irrespective of its purpose, it's hard to say no. This was, for everyone who worked on it, the most exciting period of his life. People didn't think about the ethics of it at the time. They thought about the sheer problem of solving this conundrum. Could the nucleus be harnessed for wartime use? That's part of it. Part of it is also that I had an awakening when I was in early midlife. A young woman named Jean Tatlock made me her lover and, among other things, taught me about politics. I was as disconnected from the political world as it's possible to be. It wasn't until 6 months after the stock market crash in 1929 that I first learned of it. But she awakened me and taught me that there are causes worth fighting for in this world. And two of them were workers' rights, the rights of the underclass, and secondly, of course, protecting the free world from Nazi Germany, and particularly the Jewish people from Hitler's already apparent designs, at least to persecute Jews and possibly to annihilate them.
Thank you very much.
Let's pursue that a little further, Dr. Oppenheimer. I know that you, in the works that we have seen, you really have struggled with the fact that we were in this race, and if we did not create the bomb, that Hitler would dominate the world and would use it for the destruction of democracy. Yet at the same time, you saw the results and so forth. So I have a two-part question. First of all, under the Manhattan Project, how close did we come to not having that project or not winning this struggle, knowing that Germany was working on such a weapon?
That's the profound irony of the thing. The Germans had no program. We assumed that we were in a neck race to complete it. When we invaded the mainland of Europe in 1944, we soon discovered that the German project had been abandoned as early as 1942. Adolf Hitler had signed a directive in 1942 saying that no project was to be developed that didn't have practical likelihood of being useful in the war that he was prosecuting. And so the project had been dropped. The Russians had no project. The Japanese had no project. We were alone. And I suppose it stands to reason. It took an entire continent to mobilize the resources necessary to produce this device. Hitler couldn't have done it probably even if there hadn't been a war. Russia might have done it, but not any other country. The British, for example, were in advance of ourselves physically. They knew more about the physics of the bomb than anyone, but the British had no chance of building this thing, so Churchill wisely sent his best scientists to the United States, where they were absorbed into our own project.
But as you were doing that, you had no way of knowing that it would not be successful in Germany? Or?
Absolutely. We didn't know until the invasion after Normandy. And furthermore, imagine if Hitler had had the bomb at Stalingrad, or the Battle of Moscow, or the Battle of Britain. The history of the world would have been very different indeed. In fact, let me say very, very strongly, although I developed a huge moral conscience about my work on the Manhattan Project, I believe that it was the duty of the United States to develop this device, to develop it first. If this device is going to exist, it's important that an enlightened, self-restraining nation be at the head of it. You do not want one of the less enlightened nations to be the pioneer in this technology.
And then, in addition to that, after it was constructed on the program, we only have 30 minutes, so we won't have the opportunity to go into all the details of what a mammoth undertaking that was, although the panel may want to address that some. Once it was completed and it was exploded, give us your reaction on that morning when you saw that happen.
Well, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, my reaction was one of triumph, and I think, like all Americans, I felt that the war was over, that the West had survived, that this had shortened the war. Probably 1 million young men would have been required for the invasion of the mainland of Japan, and who knows how many casualties. The estimates varied wildly. But when the test occurred, the Trinity test in New Mexico at Alamogordo on the 16th of July, 1945, I was horrified. We had no idea what we were going to get there. We knew that something would happen, but we had no idea that the bomb would be as spectacularly successful and as destructive as it turned out to be. And at that moment, what flashed into my mind was a sentence from the Hindu sacred text, the Bhagavad Gita: "I have become death, the shatterer of worlds." I truly felt a kind of Promethean sense of tragedy at that moment, that I had been the one who had opened the door to humans toying with the basic building blocks of the universe, and that we had unleashed something of destructive power beyond anything that had ever been conceived in human history. And I was going to bear this burden, and humanity was going to bear this burden for the rest of time.
Janelberg.
With that, it's very difficult to follow up, but let's go back and talk a bit about how you got to Los Alamos. Why Los Alamos, and why was it a good location in the end?
Well, I had been there as a boy, and Leslie Groves, who was the Army general in charge of the Manhattan Project, and I had to devise a site. At one time, we thought of having scattered sites around the country and keeping everyone in the dark about what everyone else was doing, but that wasn't practical. The world of physics is a creative process. It's really an art more than it is a science. And in order for me to learn from you and you to learn from me and something more interesting than either of us to emerge, we need to be engaged in open discussion. So I argued very strongly for an isolated site where there could be a fair amount of open exchange about the future of this weapon. Leslie Groves agreed as long as it was very isolated. San Bernardino was in the running, Reno was in the running, but we decided it had to be even more isolated than that, and so we chose a place that was one of my favorites, Los Alamos. I'd been there as a boy. I had said early in life, my two passions are desert and physics, and would that I could find a way to combine them. Well, now I did. Not everyone agreed. Leslie Szilard, one of the Hungarian refugee physicists, said no one can think of a godforsaken place like that. But it proved actually to be a very fine place to coordinate this project. The neighbors in the area didn't know what we were up to, and we were safe to have a fair amount of intellectual freedom. And those who were engaged in the project invariably felt that it had been made more interesting in their lives by the fact that it occurred at Los Alamos.
And there were a number of very famous people there. At one point, there were how many Nobel laureates in one room?
I think Leslie Groves said once, I have at great expense gathered the largest collection of eggheads ever. And there were 8 Nobel laureates sitting at a picnic table eating bologna sandwiches discussing the future of the world.
So it was a project that required a manager, and Leslie Groves was the manager, is that correct? I mean, if you want to put it in those terms. So you were the workers, you were the minds, he was the manager of this project.
Well, he certainly wouldn't have called himself one of the minds, but he was the man who drove it home. He got Class AAA status for the project, and he insisted that it be successful and that it come in under budget and on time. No mean fact, he had built the Pentagon at the early stages of World War II, and there had been a little bit of delay and a little bit of cost overrun in that project, and he was investigated for it, and he decided he would never be criticized again. And so that fueled him through the Manhattan Project. And everyone who was involved said he's the most interesting son of a bitch we ever met. But he was no intellectual. My job was really as a systems engineer. The Manhattan Project was partly physics, it was partly nuclear physics, but mostly it was engineering a device. How do you get a critical mass of fissionable material? How do you get it processed and deliver it at the right instant to create a portable weapon? And so really it's more engineering and systems management than it was theoretical physics.
Dr. Oppenheimer, let me follow up just a bit on that last comment. What do you see, looking back, as the critical steps or critical discoveries that made the bomb possible? And was this a pretty carefully structured, well thought out, logical sequence of events, or was there some luck involved in it?
No luck. This was as well engineered as any project in human history. Cost $2 billion, which would be hundreds of billions of dollars in your currency. Here's what happened. The physics was just coming into play. The neutron had been discovered in 1932. The first chain reaction was not reported until 1939, and yet less than 6 years later, a bomb delivered at Hiroshima. So the physics had just come into play in time for the bomb to be engineered, and then enormous engineering hurdles had to be overcome. How do you process this material? Because uranium-235, which is the fissionable element, isotope, has to be separated from uranium ore, and it exists on a ratio of 1 to 300, and processing is almost impossible. So we had the engineering of the processing of the metal. Then we had the problem of the mechanism. I don't want to go into much detail, but a nuclear device requires a critical mass of fissionable material. If you bring it together too soon, it explodes. If you don't bring it together rapidly enough, it fizzles. And so there is a kind of a moment that this all has to occur, and it requires a very precise set of firing mechanisms, the proper loading of the critical masses, and so on. This engineering problem is much more difficult than the fact of the chain reaction itself. All that had to be in place. So we had a department of metallurgy, we had a theoretical department, we had a gun department, we had a ballistics department. All of these groups were working feverishly day and night to bring this in on time. In July of 1945, we had just enough processed plutonium to test the first device. We had just gotten the implosion detonation system in place. All the little tributaries came together at just the moment when the bomb could still be used to end the war.
If Tony will allow me one more question. This one, I don't intend to be unfair, and you may not be able to answer it, but it's one that has occurred to me many times. From our perspective, in the year 2000, we've survived more than half a century now without the bomb being used again, against many predictions. Was there, at the time its use was being considered at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was there any thought given to demonstrating its power in a way that wouldn't have taken lives, rather than simply dropping it on those cities?
That's not an unfair question. This was debated in a lively fashion. Leo Szilard, a man named Frank, produced something called the Frank Report, which argued for a demonstration project, that you bring the Japanese and other members of the world community to a deserted island somewhere in the Pacific and test the device and show them what powers we have at our disposal and urge them to reconsider based upon that. I must tell you, I argued against that. There are two problems there. One is if the bomb doesn't work, Japanese resolve will get much greater. And secondly, destroying a tiny atoll may not convince the Japanese of the power of this thing, because how do you measure it on a tiny island? And so I argued, and I don't regret it, that the bomb needed to be used against a military target of known dimensions, and, this is harder, that we needed to use it against a civilian population so that the Japanese would see that if they continued their madness, we were prepared systematically to dismantle their population.
Thank you.
Dr. Oppenheimer, following all of that and the end of World War II, you did evaluate some of the results, and a very powerful moment in your life was meeting with the President of the United States, Harry Truman. Would you share with our viewers two things? One is the facts of that meeting, and secondly, does it reveal some real concerns you had of the results?
Well, the meeting occurred in the fall of 1945. Of course, Harry Truman was an accidental president, the great president. FDR had died on the 12th of April, 1945. Truman was installed in the presidency and didn't even know about the Manhattan Project. He had to be informed of it. And so he wasn't in a position to evaluate this. And there was a momentum by now. There was a momentum that meant those bombs were going to be used. If it wasn't against Germany, it was going to be against Japan. And not just one, but two. One was uranium and one was plutonium. But at any rate, I went to see him on an issue of an appointment to the United Nations, and he didn't seem to be attending to the gravity of the issue. And I said, after all, Mr. President, I have blood on my hands. He threw me out of his office. And he said when I had gone, don't bring that fellow around here again. After all, he's only the one who made the bomb. I'm the fellow who blew it up. And his view was that I had no right to my sense of moral righteousness over this question, that I was a kind of physicist engineer, and that he, the political leader of the country, was solely responsible for the decision to use the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, and that it was unfair for me to raise this question in his presence.
I would assume that you could contemplate from that comment that he thought you were saying the president had blood on his hands.
Well, we all do. You know, physicists have now known sin. And this is the question that I leave to the American people. Is the atomic device different from other weapons in degree or in kind? Is it just a much more violent weapon, more efficient in its killing power? Or does it represent something new under the sun? I believe strongly that this is something new under the sun, that humanity must find international mechanisms of cooperation and tolerance and arbitration so that there is not a third world war. We've all heard the cliche that the third world war will be fought with thermonuclear weapons and the fourth with sticks and stones. It is in the interest of humanity, because of the nuclear precipice that I helped to bring about, to grow up, to mature, and learn to live on this earth in a way that shows cooperativeness and especially mechanisms of arbitration of disputes. There will always be disputes, but we must now find a way to settle them without genocide.
One final question before I return to the panel, and that has to do with your observations of even a greater potential for destruction, the hydrogen bomb and the nuclear weapons. How did you react to that during the Cold War?
The H-bomb, the super bomb as it was called, it was Edward Teller's brainchild. It's fundamentally different in its physics. It's triggered by an atomic bomb, but it actually involves fusion and not fission. Here's the problem with it. It has no target. There is no target on Earth that can't be destroyed entirely with an atomic device, a fission device. And so a fusion device, and a hydrogen bomb as it's called, cannot do more damage than an atomic bomb. And therefore its only justification is as a weapon of genocidal purposes. How can the United States be the nation that pioneers a genocidal weapon? We didn't know what we were doing when we built the atomic device. We now know. And the hydrogen bomb is, I think, an unspeakable practice for an enlightened nation to undertake.
Janelle Berg.
Well, this was a very big event, the Manhattan Project, in your life. What happened to you after that?
Well, because I opposed the development of the H-bomb, the super bomb, and because I had had some left-wing leanings as a young scholar at Berkeley, the Cold War decided to destroy me. I had enemies, Edward Teller amongst them, Lewis Strauss, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, and others, and they dragged up some dubious incidents from my past before the Manhattan Project and made it appear as if I might have engaged in treasonable activities, that I had flirted, in a sense, with Soviet communism. This is not true. There's no evidence to support it. But there was a hearing in Washington in 1954, and afterwards my security clearance was withdrawn, and I was in disgrace. The man who essentially made it possible for Western civilization to save itself in 1945 was in national disgrace by 1955.
And so did you go back to teaching?
I did. I went to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where I held an appointment. I was the chair of it, and I spent the rest of my life there. I wrote extensively. I convened seminars on the humanities and sciences. I visited Japan in 1960. I read wildly. But my life was never the same. I was, in a sense, rehabilitated in 1963 by President Johnson when he gave me the Fermi Award in December of that year. But I was bitter, and at the end of my life was a descent from the exhilaration of the Manhattan Project and a descent from a sense of integrity because of what men like Teller did to promote what I think are questionable practices for the United States.
Steve Sheen.
Dr. Oppenheimer, let me go back a bit to something you said earlier. I believe at the beginning of the show, when we first started talking about the bombings, that you weren't certain just how powerful the weapon was.
No, we had no idea.
Were the bombs that were dropped different than the bombs that were tested at Los Alamos? Or were the tests inconclusive enough in your mind that you weren't sure what the real application of the device would be like?
No, we knew from the moment of the detonation of the Trinity bomb. It was a plutonium implosion device on the 16th of July, 1945. We knew from that moment, first, that the technology worked, and secondly, we knew something of the kind of destructive power. Now, there was no infrastructure to destroy there, but every living thing for several miles was vaporized, and a shepherd who was sleeping on a cot 15 miles away was blown off of his cot, and a blind girl on her way to Albuquerque saw for the first time that morning, and we knew that we had unleashed Promethean fire. But we also knew the kilotonnage. Enrico Fermi instantaneously estimated the kilotonnage at the site. So we knew what we had, but we had no idea what it would look like at Hiroshima. And when I went to Hiroshima in 1960, I was sobered by it. We had heard the statistics, but that's nothing like seeing the ground zero site.
And I'm not sure. I'm sure your sense of history is better than mine. That doesn't take a great deal, and you're a much more cultured and studied man than I am. But you mentioned earlier, if I take you back to that one ethical question you posed, is this device that you've created, is it different only in magnitude, or is it different in kind altogether than other weapons of war? It seems to me that in the firebombing at Dresden, and perhaps in the bombings, the conventional bombings of Tokyo, the loss of life was actually similar, or am I wrong?
Greater. There was greater loss of life. At Tokyo, for example, in the spring of 1945, I think 118,000 people were incinerated during the incendiary bombing of that city. Here's the difference. I agree that, by the end of the war, we were in a period of total warfare, and every piece of violence that we had was being used, and in a sense, you could make the argument that the atomic device was merely cleaner in some regards than incendiary bombing. But here's the difference. If you have one atomic bomb today, you will have 1,000 tomorrow and 10,000 next year. And so to reduce Dresden by carpet bombing takes hours. It takes a whole civilization's decided effort day after day after day. But to drop a simple device out of the back of a B-29 is an instant. And I was asked late in life, can these bombs be made more terrible? And I said yes. And then the reporter said, can they be made terribly more terrible? And I said, yes, indeed. You know, there is no theoretical limit to the size of a fusion device, of a hydrogen bomb. It can be 100,000 times greater than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so I believe that when you can drop a device, push a button, and vaporize 100,000 human beings as a start, as a low-tech use of that device, that you are in a new universe. It cannot be compared to a bomb that might drop on Dresden or Hamburg.
Thank you.
Now that we're coming close to the end of the program, we want to take this opportunity to tap your brilliance, and if you could look towards the future, will we even have greater weapons in the future, than more destructive than even what we have now? Is that imaginable?
Yes. It's hard to imagine because here's the genius of it. Here's why we were drawn to this project. We were taking apart the basic stuff of the universe, the atom itself. And we were proving that Einstein was the most brilliant scientist of all time when he wrote the equation E equals mc squared. If you take apart an atom, you do get that energy of the mass times the speed of light squared. And there is no limit to this. Humans are now God. We are playing with God's tools. So it's arguable that we can increase the violence and the magnitude of these devices, but I doubt that there's anything more fundamental than taking apart an atom. So in a sense, in the late 20th century, humanity had reached a pinnacle of its understanding of the nature of power. I would not rule out that some other breakthrough might still be in the works. But as far as we could tell, that was it.
On that note, we have to bring the permanent conclusion. We want to thank you, Dr. Robert J. Oppenheimer, for being with us on our journey through America's 20th century. And ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take this time to thank the Idaho Humanities Council that's made this program possible. They're very enthusiastic in their support of our program, and particularly Dr. Clay Jenkinson. They always encourage us, as we echo their viewpoint also, that he is a remarkable scholar. And he will be back with us again next week as Dr. Clay Jenkinson to talk about the 20th century. I would like to invite you to be with us for that very interesting interview with this extraordinary scholar. And then following that, we will have other weeks with other scholars we have in our community that are visiting during this symposium to talk about other historical figures. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. Show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and